Hello there! Welcome to the first debate video. My name is Tuskeh, and in this video I'm joined by two of my good friends and raid mates, Warlin and Elishan. Today we'll be discussing tanking, the changes it's going to receive with Vengeance and Resolve, whether or not there are too many tanks in the game, whether tanks should be DPSs, the old versus the new mentality, and whether other classes should be able to join tanks in their glorious role of being smacked in the face. But first, introductions. Warlin, tell us a little bit about yourself and why you're going to be helpful in this debate.
Alright, my name is Warlin. I've been playing World of Warcraft since just about the tail end of Burning Crusade. I started raiding right at the beginning of Wrath of the Lich King. Currently I'm maining a Holy Paladin as well as a Destruction Warlock. I do have two level 90 characters who are tank specs, however I don't have as much experience tanking as I do the other two. But I do know the ins and outs of both classes as well as the game as a whole, so that's how I can put my input into this subject.
Awesome. So, Ellie, tell us a bit more about you.
Oh, I am Ellie, currently running a magical, mystical Windwalker monk. I have been playing since about 6 months after the vanilla launch. I have done every role from tanking to healing to DPSing at raid content level, tier level, progression level, aside from the first portion of Cataclysm because screw Cataclysm. I have always done a very large modicum of research. I've seen a vast majority of things throughout this game, and I believe my input is valued simply because I've been there and I've done a whole lot of it.
Awesome. Alright, so we are going to start by talking about tanks in general, because as everyone knows, they are the least played role, just in general. I mean, anyone who's had to wait for a tank in Flex, an LFR, or even a 5-man knows that they are basically one of the rarest things in the universe, I swear. But I really want to talk about why that is, because I think it's a little bit more than just, oh, you only need 2 tanks per raid, or maybe 3 at a stretch, because I think there's a lot of responsibility and a lot of really interesting mentalities behind being a tank as opposed to being a healer or a DPS that a lot of people shy away from. So I'd like to hear your guys' thoughts on that.
Certainly. When you're looking at the tanks, I do believe that the fact that we only utilize 2 of them in our highest raid content is a portion of it, but for the most part, responsibility falls in. When you go to do something random with strangers, do you want to take the role that is absolutely vital, that you know exactly what you're doing, or do you just want to slide through and muck it up and be a DPS and just wiggle through being crap? It's a lot easier to get away with being a bad DPS than it is a bad tank, because everyone will yell at you if you're a bad tank because you keep dying.
I mean, adding on to that, exactly, like I said, I have 2 tanks at 90, who I don't really play that much because of that main reason, where I'm I don't want to say I'm afraid, but I'm a little more nervous jumping into a random group and just completely messing up and having a wipe be on me, rather than just being a healer or DPS and kind of not taking the spotlight. And so I think that's what sets off tanking from a lot of people.
Right, yeah.
It's pretty easy to get to shy away from tanking simply due to that responsibility.
Right, and what do you think that people who are maybe kind of shying away from tanking but also like it as a concept, what do you think they can do to get into it?
The Proving Grounds feature that they added, I think, is a phenomenal tool to actually learn how to get into that. It puts you in a simulated group environment, you know, so if you fail, your group dies. And so that's exactly what happens with a real group, except you don't get all the blame for it. You just go, oh man, I failed. Other than that, playing with friends or a guildmate rather than going into random pugs could help ease into that kind of environment.
Yeah, I would definitely say that first thing you'd want to do is actually read your tooltips and probably do some information gathering. Tanking is a large responsibility for a reason. It's extremely important, and you want to be good at it because good tanks can absolutely change the outcome of any situation. Do some research. There are plenty of good websites out there, plenty of people that can tell you things, and the Proving Grounds is a phenomenal way to see if you're up to snuff, at least for certain content level.
Agreed. Research really is important in any aspect of the game, especially when you're going into more difficult stuff, but unfortunately the barrier for entry for tanks is much higher, as Ellie said, so definitely do the research there. But kind of on that note, I've noticed really that I've done a little bit of tanking in my time in World of Warcraft, not necessarily really kind of high-end stuff, but I've noticed that really the way I played changed fairly depending on who I was tanking with, and having healed people like warriors and then a death knight. I'm curious, do you guys think that there are really too many tanks in the game at the moment, because we started off in vanilla with warriors really being the only class that can tank. Everyone else just kind of couldn't do it. And over the course of the expansions that followed, Blizzard's mentality was very much every class that has kind of that spec should be able to do that. But do you think it's kind of gotten out of control with monks now being also added?
No, I would disagree with that solely because they've done a phenomenal job with creating the monk. Whenever they released the Death Knight, we were absolutely slogged with bad people that didn't understand what was going on. And that has happened with monks as well to a certain extent, but the monk is actually built for their current mitigation model. And everyone else is just kind of being folded into it.
From like a healer's perspective, each different tank has their different playstyles, different forms of active mitigation. So as a healer, when I see, say for example, I have a Death Knight who I'm healing, Death Knights are spiky compared to any other tank. Like, I know that they're going to drop low, but then they're going to heal themselves up. So I don't really panic as much as I would if, say, a warrior got really low, because warrior don't have any self-heal. They're just straight up mitigation. Then you have like monks who have that stagger mechanic. I've never played Brewmaster, but I do know that like if you don't have a player who knows exactly when he needs to get rid of his stagger, it could be a little more hairy. So there's kind of a skill cap related to different forms of active mitigation.
There's a very high skill cap when it comes into the Brewmaster because you can tell very quickly the difference between a bad and a good one. The good ones are absolutely phenomenal and can accomplish deeds you would not anticipate at all because they know what they're doing. And you have to know what you're doing as a Brewmaster, because if you're just like, oh, I'll just slap on my gear, oh, I'll get my expertise up, that's good enough, right? And then you get in there and get your face completely ripped apart because you have no clue how to actually manage your cooldowns properly, when to use your shield, making sure your shuffle doesn't fall off. These things are very intricate with this class, and I like that fact. And I like the fact that there's a skill cap with it. If you're bad, good. I want to know it ahead of time.
I can understand that, but I mean, kind of going back to the point, talking about too many tanks. I mean, they've been introducing more classes slowly over time, and we can probably bet that they're going to be adding a new one in the future. Obviously not in Warlords, but sometime in the future. I'd be very surprised if they didn't. And if that class can also tank, that would be another tank, really. And do you think that, as you said, with the monks, there is quite that skill cap to entry, and really every tank has a skill cap of some degree? Do you think that with just more choices like that, that either those skill barriers are going to get smaller, or that there's just going to be less diversity and you can go from one tank to another without really having to change too much?
They've done a phenomenal job of adding diversity in the tanks they have, including the addition of the Brewmaster. Because there was a significant amount of difference back in the day, but it was mainly difference in their capabilities. When you're looking at Burning Crusade, a warrior versus a paladin tank, warriors were absolute garbage on any sort of AoE pull. When you're in the first parts of Karazhan going into the ghost rooms and the ballroom, it was just terrible if you had a warrior. Basically, it meant if you had a mage, they were going to die because the warrior couldn't do the threat. Paladins, on the other hand, that consecrate was phenomenal. I'm fine with the diversity, especially the way they've been going so far with it. I don't want to get overslogged with too many more. If they go to add another class in the future, I actually would say they need to shy away from adding another tanking class, because that's all they've thrown at us. With every class they've thrown at us is a tank.
See, I would actually beg to differ. I think that more options is a good thing, as long as they're all viable. And something that you've seen over the years is that each tank class kind of falls into its own niche. Brewmasters, for example, phenomenal kiting. Like, if I ever need something kited, I'm going to get a Brewmaster. AoE threat, paladins are really good at getting snap threat, whereas warriors are really not that good at getting AoE snap threat, but they're really good at mitigating and getting, boss threat. Druids can kind of fill any niche required of them because of all symbiosis and that kind of stuff like that. So I think as long as they don't add another tank class that is kind of just a carbon copy of anything else and it falls into its own little niche, I think it can be a good thing.
I'm totally cool with there being the diversity and the niche portion, but then we're looking at certain problems. Certain problems like where you absolutely require this class, if they're only running with 2 tanks in Mystic rating, or Mythic rating, once Warlord comes out, and there becomes to be boss fights where it turns out if you have a warrior you can absolutely nullify half of the encounters, then people are going, if there are encounters like that, then warrior tanks are going to be what's brought in the high-end raids, and monks are not going to get to go, druids, everyone else is going to get shut out, which we've had these issues in this rating tier and in every rating tier. When we start to add more, we're going to have to add more diversity. Well, how do we make this class play different than the other tanks? And we're going to open ourselves up to even more possibility of other people and other classes getting excluded or put to the wayside because they can't perform that specific task.
But see, I don't really think that that's that big of an issue. On the world first level, probably, yeah, you're going to want to stack certain classes. But for any run-of-the-mill guild who's not going to have, people automatically available to play every single class, it kind of adds another level of adapting to certain strategies. Like, say for instance, in the last tier at Tot, if you had a Paladin tank, Horadon became exponentially easier. You had Paladin dedicated to the boss, you had your off-tank dedicated to ads. No swapping required at all. It just completely trivialized that encounter. World first guilds probably used Paladins for that, but if a normal guild didn't have a Paladin, they had to actually work without that. So I think it kind of allows deeper, kind of levels of how to go about fighting an actual encounter, and I think that's a good thing.
That mentality is fine, and don't get me wrong, I am all about having multiple options available and using the options that work best for the situation. But just like Blizzard's trying to do, they're trying to make the game so that it's not exclusive of individuals and certain playstyles. They want to make this content available to everyone, even to the fault of destroying certain things in the economy, but we won't get into LFR. But Muru. Back when Muru was being fought in the Sunwell, you had to bring Resto Shamans. If you didn't bring a certain quota of Resto Shamans, good luck, because there was just so much damage going out and Chain Heal was so absolutely powerful. And that stayed that way for way too long. And that's no fun for anybody.
Yeah, I guess I have to go back to that. Because, like, in Burning Crusade, how many players even saw Sunwell, or saw the end of Sunwell? The game is just different from when it was back then. Content is more readily available to the majority of the players now than it was back in Vanilla or Burning Crusade.
It seems like it's also going to be going in that direction in the future, because with Warlords bringing in flexible raids, you can get a team together of really any size. As long as you've got more than 10 players and you've got the right composition, you're golden. So it does seem
Absolutely.
like things are going to be designed very differently. I will admit, though, that there are a couple of cases even now, with the amount of tanks that we currently have, that there are some cases where, especially monks, if you have a monk that's tanking, then you can circumvent a lot of the danger of a fight. I mean, I know, for instance, when we do the Dark Shaman, we have Ellie go from Windwalker to Brewmaster just to go with a 3-tank strategy, and having that option with the 3 tanks not only trivializes a lot of the mechanics from the other 2 bosses, which is not so much the point here, but the thing is, when the ads from Cardrus spawn, Ellie can just stay at range, avoid all of the damage, and get instant AoE threat. And coming from an elemental shaman, I just spam Chain Lightning the second they come out, and I cannot get aggro off of him. If that were any other tank, it would be impossible. The only other alternative would be they get threat and take loads of damage, but the monk can just completely avoid that. Same with Garrosh. The ads can easily be tanked by a monk just by kiting them, and they can really kind of be nullified in that regard. One of my worries, really, with having more tanks is that, I mean, A, they're going to be really powerful, but B, what kind of niche could they fill, do you think? I mean, I'm curious to hear what you two could think, because we've already got the tank that could kite, the tank that's really great at just getting in there and holding single threat, the tank that's great with AoE threat, the tank that's great with self-healing, but what other niches do you possibly think that could exist?
Well, even with their niches, they've obliterated some of them. The Death Knight has changed so much. When it first came out, if you had a boss that was magic-based, you wanted a DK tanking it simply because anti-magic shell, you had multiple different ways to interrupt and deal with magical damage. Now every tank has some sort of thing where it's like, oh, by the way, magical damage? Screw you. All of them, monks, paladins, warriors, DKs, druids, they all have something. Oh, I don't know if druids, I don't deal with bears. But they all have something that helps them nullify damage more. I don't want to get too niche heavy when it comes to the tanks, because again, then we can the higher end guilds will end up getting more secluded or exclusive in certain encounters in certain situations, and that's not something anybody wants. Nobody wants to show up for a raid and then be told, oh, by the way, you can't come because your time and energy you've put in wasn't what we needed. We needed you to do it this way. Sorry.
But it's not like every single boss in a raid is going to have the exact same encounter design. And so you could build a roster with every single kind of tank. And again, this is really like those high-end guilds where they're going to rotate players in and out. But as far as new niches to fill, I mean, you pretty much got them all. We've got the self-healing tank, we've got the AoE tank, we've got the single target tank, we've got the kiting tank and the high DPS tank. I really don't know if there's anything that they could add, at least currently. With new tank design, possibly they could make something that works well with that, but I don't know.